Hey everyone, in this section we look at a model of aggregate demand and aggregate supply, and we are going to use this to explain the total demand and total supply in an economy. Aggregate supply shows the total quantity of output or real gross domestic product the farms will produce and sell at each price level, holding input prices constant. By input prices, we mean the price of labor, land, or any other natural resources. Then we define potential gross domestic product. By potential gross domestic product, we mean the real gross domestic product that is produced using all the resources or all the inputs in an economy, and we are producing the maximum real gross domestic product. Another name for potential gross domestic product is full employment gross domestic product, and the unemployment associated with full employment gross domestic product is called the natural rate of unemployment. In this slide, we will look at the different parts of the aggregate supply curve. The aggregate supply curve slopes from very flat to nearly vertical at the far right. Now look at the various shaded portions of this aggregate supply curve. The first part or the far left I have shaded in blue, and looks like the output is very low. When output is very low, unemployment is very high on the far left of the aggregate supply curve. The real gross domestic product at this part is less than potential gross domestic product. Definitely the factories are working part-time, and if we increase prices by a little bit, the output will increase by leaps and bounds. So my assumption here all over this graph is my input prices are fixed, and in this far left of the aggregate supply curve, if we increase prices by a little bit, all the businesses which were working part-time will swing into production, and real gross domestic product will increase by a lot because there will be a large increase in aggregate supply. The reason for this is when prices are increasing, the farms want to produce more to earn higher profits. Now take a look at this intermediate part of the aggregate supply curve that is shaded in green. Over this part, when the price increases, the real gross domestic product is also going to go up, but the increase in the real gross domestic product is not as significant as this blue shaded part. Now I'm going to look at the far right of this aggregate supply curve, where the aggregate supply becomes nearly vertical. At this quantity, higher prices for output cannot encourage additional output. The reason for this is even if the farms want to increase output beyond this point, it cannot really do significantly because all the inputs are being fully employed. This part is called the full employment gross domestic product. All the inputs are working overtime, and if the farm succeeds in producing beyond the full employment gross domestic product, it cannot be sustained for a long period of time. Okay, so this full employment gross domestic product is also associated with potential gross domestic product. Okay. Now let's look at aggregate demand curve. Aggregate demand refers to the total spending on domestic goods and services in an economy. Aggregate demand consists of 4 components. These are consumption, investment, government spending, and net exports. Look at the shape of the aggregate demand curve. The aggregate demand slopes down. And I will look at 3 causes why the aggregate demand slopes down. Or rather, I'm going to look at 3 effects and 1 cause. What happens when price goes up? When price goes up, the consumption will go down because the purchasing power goes down. This is called the wealth effect. So say the price is increasing from 85 to 95, and we are going to move to the left of the aggregate demand curve because the quantity of spending or quantity of aggregate demand will go down when the price goes up, because consumption goes down and consumption is a part of aggregate demand. Number 2, or the second effect, we look at the interest rate effect. When prices increases, interest rate in the economy goes up, and interest rates are inversely related to investment. So the investment is going to go down. When investment goes down, the quantity of domestic spending or aggregate demand goes down. And number 3, we have the foreign purchases effect. So the assumption is the prices in the US is going up and prices in the rest of the world are staying the same. So we have access to cheaper domestic product, and products produced in the US is way more expensive than products produced internationally. So the US is going to import more and export less. Export goes down, import goes up, and this x minus m, this is the whole thing is the net. Sorry about that. This x minus m, this is called net exports. This is going to go down because of US exports going down and US imports going up. Okay. Now let's look at short-run aggregate supply and long-run aggregate supply. This is how the short-run aggregate supply curve will look like, and this is a positive. This has a positive slope. This tells us price is positively related to real gross domestic product. When price increases, the aggregate supply increases. And if we look at long-run aggregate supply curve, if we increase prices, the real gross domestic product is not going to increase, and we are at the potential gross domestic product. So let's look at 2 other intersection points. Whenever the aggregate demand is intersecting aggregate supply, this point of intersection is called real gross domestic product. Now over here I have the long run aggregate supply curve, the short run aggregate supply curve and the aggregate demand curve, all of them together in the same graph. And this long run aggregate supply curve is associated with potential gross domestic product. I see my potential gross domestic product is 9,500. My real gross domestic product is, I would say, 9,000 or 8,800, close to 9,000, because the real gross domestic product here is less than potential gross domestic product. The economy is going through a recession. So only when we have the aggregate demand, short run aggregate supply, and the long run aggregate supply, all of them intersecting each other, we will say the real gross domestic product is equal to the potential gross domestic product. Okay, that's all with all this aggregate demand, short run aggregate supply, and long run aggregate supply tools. Thank you very much.